In the summer of 2019, a farmer named Marcus Webb walked his land for the last time, not because he wanted to, but because nobody was left to walk it with him. The sprawling expanse of fertile ground stretched across his vision like the lines of a map worn through from too much handling. 240 acres of Iowa soil, dark and rich, the kind that had sustained his family for 4 generations. His grandfather had worked this land during the Depression, his father had expanded it through the boom years of the 80s, and Marcus himself had inherited it at 32, full of hope and determination. Now at 61 he was walking away from it, not to retire to some comfortable cabin on the edge of town, but because there was no one, not a single person in his family, willing to carry the torch forward. He stopped at the fence line where the soybeans gave way to the access road. The plants stretched endlessly, waves of green moving like a living sea in the warm wind. He could hear them rustling, a sound that had been the soundtrack of his entire existence. His hands, weathered and strong, gripped the weathered wood of the fence post. His father's fence post, really. The wood was graying now, starting to splinter. How many times had his father stood here doing the same thing? But this wasn't a moment of contemplation or peace. This was a moment of surrender. Marcus had 3 children. The oldest, Sarah, was a software engineer in San Francisco. She hadn't set foot on the farm since 2004. His middle child, David, was an accountant in Chicago. The youngest, Emily, had moved to New York to pursue a career in theater. Not one of them had shown the slightest interest in farming. Not one of them understood why their father would wake at 4 in the morning to tend animals, why he would spend his days bent over soil and machinery, why he would watch the sky for signs of rain, the way other men watched for falling stock prices. When Marcus had asked them one by one if they might consider coming back, really coming back, not for a weekend visit, but to settle, to learn, to take over, the responses had been remarkably similar. Sadness, yes, guilt, perhaps, but also a kind of relief, as if his question had given them permission to admit something they'd been thinking all along. Farming wasn't for them. It had never been for them. They loved their father, but they didn't love the land the way he did. This wasn't an isolated story in Iowa. It wasn't even unusual in rural America. In fact, it was becoming the story, the dominant narrative of the early 21st century countryside. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The numbers told a stark picture. In 1935, there were nearly 7 million farms in the United States. By 2019, that number had dropped to just over 2 million. The average age of American farmers had climbed from 50 to 58 and was continuing its steady rise. Every year, more farmers reached retirement age than young people entered farming. Every year, the gap widened. Every year, something essential was being lost. But these weren't just numbers. Numbers were abstractions. What was really happening was more profound, more intimate, and more troubling. What was happening was the death of a way of life, played out across thousands of small towns, and countless family gatherings, repeated in thousands of painful conversations between aging farmers and their uninterested children. The causes were layered and complex. Farming had become brutal in its economics. A young person starting out today would need anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million in equipment just to get started. Land prices had risen dramatically, making it nearly impossible for new farmers to buy their way in without substantial family wealth or inheritance. The margins were razor thin. A bad year could wipe out decades of profit. Banks were reluctant to lend to new farmers. Agricultural schools were closing. The knowledge that had once been passed down through families had been reduced to technical manuals and YouTube videos that couldn't convey the intuitive understanding that came from a lifetime in the fields. And perhaps most significantly, there was a fundamental shift in what young people wanted from life. The call of the cities had always been strong, but in the last few decades it had become almost irresistible. Cities offered opportunity, diversity, culture, anonymity, and a kind of freedom that small towns couldn't provide. They offered escape from the narrow expectations that rural life could impose. And they offered something else that was perhaps equally important. They offered the possibility of not having to work with your hands in the dirt and the mud and the filth, under the brutal sun and the freezing snow dependent on weather and markets and forces completely beyond your control. Farming was hard. It always had been. But for most of American history, young people had endured it because there was no real alternative. When your entire world was 20 miles in radius, when education was scarce, when moving away required resources you didn't have, you stayed and you farmed because that was what your family did. Now, the entire world was accessible. A teenager in rural Nebraska could watch videos of Paris, Tokyo, and New York on their phone. They could apply to universities across the country and the world. They could imagine lives so radically different from their parents' lives that choosing to stay and farm seemed almost absurd. Why would you stay in a tiny town doing back-breaking labor for uncertain returns when you could move to a city, get an education, pursue a career in something that interested you? The children of farmers could see other possibilities, and they took them. This exodus had consequences that rippled far beyond the individual farms themselves. Small towns began to decline. If young people weren't staying to farm, they weren't staying to live. The schools got smaller. The local businesses struggled as there were fewer customers and fewer workers. The main streets that had bustled with activity began to empty. Hardware stores closed, diners closed, banks consolidated. The infrastructure of rural life began to crumble because the human population it had been built to serve was disappearing. Marcus had watched this happen in his own town of Riverside, population 2,100. In his childhood, it had been a thriving place. There was a movie theater, a bowling alley, 2 banks, 3 grocery stores, and dozens of small shops. The high school had 400 students. Now the high school had 75. The movie theater had been closed since 1987. The bowling alley was gone. There was 1 grocery store left, run by a husband and wife in their 70s, who didn't know what they would do when they became too old to work. People who had spent their entire lives in rural areas sometimes didn't fully grasp how profound this decline was. They saw it happening gradually, year by year, so the shock was muted. But occasionally someone would move away and then come back after years of living in a city, and the impact would hit them like a physical blow. How much smaller everything looked. How many empty storefronts, how few young people were visible on the streets, how the vitality had drained away. And yet the paradox was that America still needed food. In fact, it needed more food than ever. The population was growing, the economy was expanding. The global demand for American agricultural products was enormous. So what happened when there were no young farmers to produce that food? The answer was that farming had changed. It had become industrialized, mechanized, and consolidated. The small family farms that had once characterized American agriculture were being replaced by large-scale agricultural operations, often run by corporations and managed by employees rather than family members. The equipment became more expensive, but also more efficient, allowing a single farmer or a small crew to manage vastly more land than had been possible just decades earlier. The animals were confined in enormous facilities. The crops were modified genetically to maximize yield and minimize the labor required. The whole system became focused on one thing: production and profit. This system worked in a purely mechanical sense. The food was produced, the markets were fed, the corporations made money. But something profound had been lost in the transition. The work that had once been done by millions of farmers, each connected to their own piece of land, each understanding intimately the soil and the weather and the rhythms of the seasons, was now done by machines operated by a shrinking pool of agricultural workers, many of whom were poorly paid, often from immigrant populations and frequently treated as interchangeable cogs in a much larger machine. The knowledge that had accumulated over centuries, how to read the land, how to understand what the soil needed, how to work with nature rather than simply trying to dominate it, was being lost. Young people weren't learning it because there was no one to teach them. Farmers in their 60s and 70s who possessed decades of hard-won understanding were dying and taking that knowledge with them. The books and the manuals and the technical specifications couldn't capture what a lifetime of observation and experience could teach. And the connection between people and the land was being severed. For most of human history, the vast majority of people lived in direct contact with the earth and its products. They understood where food came from, because they grew it, or they lived near people who did. They understood the seasons because their lives were organized around them. They understood their dependence on nature because they felt it in their bones. Now, food appeared in supermarkets, pre-packaged and processed, stripped of any connection to the earth or the people who had grown it. Most Americans had no idea where their food came from, how it was grown, or what chemicals or processes it had undergone. They certainly didn't know the farmers. They had no relationship to the land beyond what they saw driving through on the highway. This disconnect had consequences, though they were often invisible to those living in cities. It meant that agricultural policy was made by people with no real understanding of farming. It meant that environmental damage caused by industrial farming was accepted as inevitable and necessary rather than questioned. It meant that as the system became more and more unstable, whether through climate change, soil degradation, water depletion, or the simple unsustainability of the current model, there were fewer and fewer people with the knowledge to imagine alternatives. Marcus had read all the articles and the studies. He understood intellectually what was happening to farming in America, but understanding it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. When he stood in his fields, what he felt was simply grief. His father, John Webb, had been one of those farmers who understood the land in a way that transcended technical knowledge. John had died in 1998, at the age of 73, having worked the farm for 55 years. Marcus had been 37 at the time, at the peak of his own career, and he had inherited not just the land, but also his father's deep, almost spiritual connection to it. John had never read much, and he'd never cared much for new technology. He worked the way his father had worked, with some modifications for the times. He paid attention to the soil. He practiced crop rotation. He kept notes in careful handwriting about weather and yields and what had worked and what hadn't. He could look at a field and tell if the nitrogen was depleted. He could taste the soil between his teeth and tell if it had the right mineral content. He knew the names of the birds and what it meant if they appeared or disappeared. He knew which way the wind came from in different seasons. He was illiterate in the modern sense. He didn't read industry publications or attend conferences, but he was profoundly literate in the language of the land. Marcus had learned from him. As a child, Marcus had walked the fields with his father, and John had taught him to see the things that John saw. By the time Marcus was a teenager, he had inherited not just his father's land, but also his father's understanding of it. This knowledge was as real and as valuable as any degree from an agricultural university, though it was never written down or formally certified. When John died, Marcus was devastated in the way that sons are devastated by the loss of fathers who have taught them how to see the world. But he was also ready. He had been preparing for this transition his entire life. Taking over the farm hadn't been a choice for him. It was simply what he was going to do. It was who he was. He had worked the farm for another 20 years with the kind of dedication that borders on obsession. He had expanded it carefully, improved the soil, invested in better equipment, and developed relationships with his equipment dealers, his banks, the agricultural agencies that provided support and guidance. He had become one of the more successful farmers in the county, not because he was driven by ambition in any conventional sense, but simply because he loved what he did, and he did it well. He had also married, had 3 children, and tried to pass on to them what his father had passed on to him. He had taken them to the fields. He had explained the work. He had tried to convey not just the technical knowledge, but also the deeper connection to the land that had defined his own life. It hadn't worked. His children had heard his explanations, and they had understood them intellectually, but the knowledge hadn't taken root in them the way it had in him. Or perhaps more accurately, they had understood but had decided it wasn't for them. It was their choice, ultimately. He respected that, but their choice meant that when Marcus reached retirement age, there would be no one to take over the farm. The knowledge that his father had passed to him, that he had spent decades refining and deepening, would die with him. The soil that his grandfather and his father and he himself had tended and improved for 100 years would either be abandoned or sold to someone else. Likely a corporation that would work it according to purely economic calculations, strip the soil of whatever value it had in the short term, and move on when it was exhausted. This was the moment Marcus was facing now. Not just the moment of his own retirement, but the moment of the death of his family's farming legacy. He hadn't accepted this gracefully. For years, he had harbored the hope that one of his children might reconsider. Sarah was the oldest, and for a while he had thought she might be the one. She had been interested in his work as a teenager, had asked intelligent questions, had shown some of that intuitive understanding of the land that he had. But when she went to college, she had discovered computers, and that was that. She was brilliant at code, and she had been recruited by one of the big tech companies, and she had moved away, and she had never looked back. David had briefly considered coming back to help with the farm, right after college when he was still young and malleable. Marcus had been hopeful, but David had found accounting fascinating, and he had gotten an offer from a firm in Chicago, and he had taken it, and that had been the end of that. Emily had never been interested in farming, not even a little bit. She had been drawn to art and music and theatre from an early age, and farming seemed to her like a kind of death sentence. She couldn't imagine a life less interesting or less fulfilling. Marcus had tried not to resent them for their choices. He had tried to be understanding and supportive, but there was a part of him that felt abandoned, even though he understood intellectually that they weren't abandoning anything. They were just choosing different lives, that was their right. So now, at 61, Marcus was facing a decision. He could continue farming, alone or with hired help, for another few years until his body gave out. He could try to keep the land in the family, hoping that maybe one of his grandchildren might develop an interest in it. Or he could sell. Selling was the practical choice. The land was worth more than it had ever been. Real estate developers were interested in the property, thinking about suburban sprawl. He could sell it and use the money to retire comfortably. He could move to one of those places he and his wife had talked about, maybe Arizona, maybe somewhere on the coast. He could travel. He could spend time with his grandchildren, but selling also meant letting go of something that had anchored him for his entire life. It meant admitting that he was the last of his line. It meant that a century of Webb family farming would come to an end. It meant that the land that his ancestors had first broken and cleared would pass into the hands of strangers who would treat it as a commodity rather than a responsibility. Every farmer in rural America was facing some version of this choice. They were reaching the age where they had to decide, keep farming against the odds, or sell and move on, and almost all of them were choosing to sell. The history of American agriculture is, in many ways, the story of consolidation. In the beginning, there were small family farms scattered across the landscape, each one producing enough to feed a family with a small surplus to trade or sell. This model worked fine for most of American history, but starting in the latter half of the 20th century, the economics of agriculture began to change. Machinery became more efficient and more expensive. Chemicals allowed farmers to increase yields dramatically. Transportation networks became more sophisticated, allowing agricultural products to be shipped long distances. Suddenly, it became possible and profitable to farm at a much larger scale. The government encouraged this through various subsidy programs and policies that favored large-scale production. The market encouraged it because large-scale producers could produce food more cheaply than small-scale farmers. Corporate interests encouraged it because they saw opportunities for profit. Young farmers who might have taken over family farms were faced with an impossible arithmetic. To be competitive, they needed more land and more equipment than their fathers had needed. But the cost of acquiring that land and equipment was beyond what most young people could afford. Banks were willing to lend to established farmers with proven track records, but they were reluctant to take a chance on someone starting out, especially if that someone didn't have significant family wealth or land to put up as collateral. So the farms consolidated. Successful farmers bought their neighbors' land when the neighbors retired. Corporate agricultural operations moved in and bought multiple farms. Equipment dealers became equipment manufacturers and then became parts of larger corporations. The supply chains became more complex and more controlled by fewer and fewer companies. By 2019, when Marcus was making his decision, the consolidation was nearly complete. The majority of American agricultural production was done by a small number of enormous operations. The family farm, which had been the backbone of rural America for so long, was becoming a relic. This consolidation happened partly because of economics and partly because of demographics. As the children of farmers refused to come back to the land, their parents had no choice but to sell. The land had to go somewhere. Most of it went to the large operations that could afford to buy it. But there was also a self-reinforcing cycle at play. As the small farms disappeared and the large operations grew, rural communities declined. Schools closed, businesses disappeared, and opportunities dwindled. This made rural life even less attractive to young people, accelerating the exodus. As young people left, the remaining farms had even more difficulty finding workers and support services. It became harder and harder to survive as a small farmer, which accelerated the consolidation even more. Some farmers tried to resist this tide. They tried to find niche markets, growing organic produce or raising animals without antibiotics. They tried to sell directly to consumers, cutting out the middlemen and keeping more of the profit. They tried to form cooperatives with other small farmers to gain economies of scale. Some of these efforts worked, at least for a while. But they were almost always small-scale operations, serving limited markets, and they couldn't compete with the massive industrial operations on price. The industrial model had one overwhelming advantage. It was cheaper. That was almost the only thing that mattered in the broader food system. The consumers wanted cheap food, and the industrial system delivered it. The fact that the cheap food came at a cost to the soil, to the water, to the animals, to the rural communities, to the farmers themselves. These costs were externalized, pushed off onto society at large, or simply ignored. Farmers who wanted to compete had to play by the rules of the game, and the rules favored consolidation and industrialization, so they adapted, or they failed, or they quit. Marcus had never tried to become a big operation. He had always run a traditional mixed farm, growing corn and soybeans, raising some cattle, keeping the farm at a size that he could manage himself with occasional help from hired workers during harvest. It had been a good living, not luxurious but comfortable. He had been able to send his children to good universities. He had been able to save for retirement. But as the years went on, the margins had gotten tighter. The price of equipment and fuel and chemicals had gone up, while the prices he got for his crops had stagnated. He had watched his neighbors, the ones who were still farming, consolidate their operations, buying more land, investing in bigger equipment, taking on more debt. Some of them had failed when the debt became too much or the prices dropped too far. Others had succeeded, at least for a while, but even they were under constant pressure to produce more, to be more efficient, to reduce costs. Marcus had resisted this pressure as long as he could, not out of any romantic notion about the superiority of small farming, but simply because he liked his life the way it was. He liked knowing all his land intimately. He liked being able to walk his fields every day. He liked not being so dependent on debt and chemical inputs and the complex machinery that required constant repairs and updates. But he had also seen the writing on the wall. The long-term trends were clear. The world was moving away from farming like his toward farming like the industrial model. If he wanted to continue farming, he would have to change. But changing would mean becoming something different, something that he wasn't sure he wanted to be. So he had done what millions of farmers before him had done. He had decided that it was time to let go. The decision to sell didn't happen all at once. It was a process, a gradual acceptance of something that was inevitable. First, there was the moment when Marcus realized that his children weren't going to come back. That had been 5 years earlier, when he had sat down with each of them individually and asked them directly if they would consider returning to the farm. He had framed it carefully, not as pressure, but as an honest question. He had wanted to give them the opportunity if they wanted to take it. All 3 of them had said no. They had been kind about it. They loved their father, and they didn't want to hurt him, but they were also clear. This wasn't something they wanted to do with their lives. The second moment had come about a year later, when Marcus had realized that he wasn't going to push the issue. He had raised his children to be independent thinkers and to pursue their own paths. To now pressure them to come back to the farm would be to deny them the very freedom that he had tried to give them. So he let go of that hope. The third moment had been more recent, when he had turned 60 and started really thinking about what it would look like to keep farming without a succession plan. At 60, he was still healthy and capable, but he wasn't young anymore. His knees bothered him, his back wasn't what it used to be. Equipment work that had been easy 10 years ago was now exhausting. Weather that he had once taken in stride now sometimes seemed excessive, the heat too hot, the cold too cold. He had another 8 to 10 years of good farming in him, he thought, maybe 15 if he was lucky. But that was it. Sooner or later he would have to stop. And when he did, the land would have to go to someone else. He had run the numbers, and they were stark. If he sold now, with the land at its current market value, he would be able to retire comfortably. His wife, Sarah, not his daughter Sarah, but his wife, also named Sarah, would be fine. They could travel. They could help their children and grandchildren with financial support if needed. They could live well for the rest of their lives. If he kept farming, he would be working until he physically couldn't anymore. He would be extracting every possible dollar from the land. And at the end of that time, when he finally had to sell, the land would still go to someone else. The only difference would be that he would be older and more tired. So the logic pointed towards selling. It was time to let go. But letting go of something that has defined your entire existence is not simple, even when you know logically that it's the right thing to do. Marcus had been wrestling with his grief in the months leading up to the decision. His wife had noticed. She had tried to be supportive, but there was a limit to what she could do. This was something he had to work through on his own. One of the ways he coped was by spending as much time as possible in the fields. As the summer of 2019 progressed, he found himself doing this more and more. He would wake up at dawn and spend the morning walking the property, just observing. He would sit in the field sometimes, not doing anything, just being there. He was trying to burn the experience into his memory, to hold on to it as long as possible. He had never thought of himself as a sentimental person, but now he found himself being almost obsessively nostalgic. He found himself thinking about his father constantly, remembering conversations they had had, remembering work they had done together. He found himself thinking about his own childhood, running through the fields, his father explaining the names of the crops and the tools, teaching him to see the land the way his father saw it. He found himself thinking about his children too, and wondering if he had done something wrong. Had he not explained it well enough? Had he not made it seem appealing enough? Had he been too intense about it, too demanding? Maybe if he had been different, if he had approached it differently, they would have been more interested. But then he would stop himself. His children had made their own choices. They were happy, or at least they seemed to be. Sarah loved her work in Silicon Valley. David loved his accounting firm. Emily loved her theater. They weren't damaged or lost. They were just people who had been born to a farmer and had decided that they didn't want to be farmers themselves. That was fine. That was normal. That was how the world worked. But it was also the reason that family farms were disappearing, because in every single case at least one child had decided that they didn't want this life. And when that happened enough times, the whole system collapsed. One morning in early July, Marcus went out to his favorite spot in the fields, a small rise about a quarter-mile from the house where you could see out across most of his property. The corn was chest-high at this point, thick and vigorous, growing the way corn is supposed to grow. The soybeans were also looking good. The weather had been cooperative, not too much rain, or too little, and the temperatures had been moderate. It was looking like it could be a good year. He stood there for a long time, looking out across the green expanse. It occurred to him that this might be the last good year he would ever see on this land. If he sold, someone else would farm it after him. That person might get a bad year or a good year or a mediocre year, but Marcus wouldn't be here to see it. And then he thought, why should I care? Why should I care if someone else gets a bad year or a good year? I'm letting it go. I'm moving on. I should just accept that and be at peace with it. But he couldn't seem to make himself feel that way. While Marcus was wrestling with his decision in Iowa, similar decisions were being made by thousands of other farmers across rural America. The agricultural census data that would be collected at the end of the year would show that this was part of a larger pattern. In 2017, there had been approximately 2.04 million farms in the United States. By 2022, that number would have dropped to just under 2 million. Within 5 years, 100,000 farms would have disappeared. Most of those farms were small to medium-sized operations, like Marcus's. They were the kind of farms that had formed the backbone of rural America. When they disappeared, something fundamental changed about the landscape and the communities that depended on them. The data was clear, but the human reality behind the data was even more stark. Each farm that disappeared was a family story. It was someone like Marcus, facing the decision of whether to sell. It was children like his who had moved away and built different lives. It was a community that had lost the people and the economic activity that had sustained it. In the town of Riverside, Iowa, where Marcus lived, the population had been declining steadily for decades. In 1950, it had been about 3,500 people. By 2019, it was down to about 2,100. The people who had left were mostly young people, the people who would have been expected to stay and take over family businesses and farms. Their departure had left behind a population that was increasingly elderly and increasingly struggling to maintain the basic services that a town needed. The high school had been consolidated with two neighboring town schools about 15 years earlier, and now students had to bus in from a wider area. This meant that the high school was even smaller, 75 students as Marcus had thought earlier, and it was located in a different town altogether. The school building in Riverside had been repurposed into a community center, but it didn't get much use. The bank had been absorbed into a larger regional bank about 10 years ago. Now the local branch was staffed by managers who lived in the county seat, about 40 minutes away. Decision-making happened in that county seat, or even further away, in the state capital. The bank was no longer part of the community the way it used to be. It was just a branch office, interchangeable with every other branch. The diner was still operating, but it was running on fumes. The owner, a woman named Ruth who had run it for 30 years, was in her mid-70s. She didn't have a clear succession plan. Her children didn't want to run a diner. When Ruth finally retired, the diner would probably close. The grocery store, the one remaining grocery store, was operated by Bob and Susan Mitchell, who were both in their early 70s. They had owned the store since the late 1980s. They worked long hours, 6 days a week, and they were starting to feel the strain. But they also couldn't afford to hire additional help, because there wasn't enough business to support it. Customers were driving to the larger towns, 15, 20, 30 minutes away, to shop at the big chain supermarkets that had better prices and larger selections. Bob and Susan's store survived mostly on the patronage of elderly people who didn't want to make the drive, or people buying forgotten items at the last minute. This was the reality of rural America in the early 21st century. The towns were hollowed out. The young people had left. The businesses that had sustained the communities were in terminal decline. The infrastructure was aging, and there wasn't enough population to justify maintaining it. The political power of rural areas in state and national governments was declining as the population declined. Funding for rural services was being reduced because there were fewer people paying taxes to support them, and at the center of this decline was agriculture. The farms were disappearing, and as they disappeared, the rural economy collapsed along with them. Farm families used to do their shopping locally, supporting local businesses. Farm implements had to be repaired by local equipment dealers. Farm labor was provided by local people. The whole system had been interconnected. As the farms consolidated and became more industrial, many of these local connections were severed. Large farms bought their equipment directly from manufacturers, bypassing the local dealer. They hired seasonal workers, sometimes from other states or countries, rather than employing local people. They did their banking and their shopping and their business dealings with larger regional or national companies rather than local businesses. This meant that even though agriculture was still producing wealth and generating economic activity, that wealth was no longer staying in the rural communities. It was flowing to the corporations and the large operations and the distant urban centers. The small towns were being left behind. Marcus understood all of this intellectually. He read the papers. He followed the news. He understood what was happening to rural America. But understanding it intellectually didn't make it hurt less. It didn't make the decision to sell any easier. By mid-July, Marcus had made his decision. He was going to sell. He had told his wife first. Sarah had cried a little bit, even though she had seen it coming. They had talked about it abstractly for years, but there was a difference between talking about something abstractly and actually deciding to do it. Once Marcus decided, it became real. He had called a real estate agent who specialized in farm sales. The agent was a woman named Jennifer, who had grown up in the area but had moved to Des Moines as an adult. She came back to the farm to do an appraisal. As Jennifer walked the property with Marcus, taking photos and making notes, Marcus found himself telling her stories about how his father had cleared certain sections, about a particularly wet year when the south field had almost become a pond, about a drought year in the mid-80s when he had thought he would lose everything. But then the rains came just in time, about the time his son David had gotten his foot stuck in a fence and Marcus had to carry him back to the house while his wife drove the pickup truck alongside them. Jennifer listened patiently. She had heard versions of these stories before. Every farmer had stories, but she was professional enough not to make Marcus feel foolish for telling them. She seemed to understand that part of the reason farmers told stories when they were selling their land was that they were trying to preserve something, as if by narrating the history, they could somehow prevent it from being erased when the land changed hands. "It's a beautiful property," Jennifer said. "You've taken good care of it." Marcus nodded. He appreciated the compliment, but it also made him sad, because taking care of it hadn't been about creating something beautiful. It had just been about doing his job. And now someone else would take that care or wouldn't. The land would pass out of his hands, and it would be whatever it was going to be to the next person who owned it. The appraisal came back at what Marcus thought was a reasonable price. The real estate market for agricultural land had been strong in the years leading up to 2019. Land values had risen steadily. 100 acres, which might have sold for $30,000 an acre 10 years earlier, now might command $45,000 or more. Marcus's land, which had been well maintained and well managed, would likely be at the higher end of that range. It was also, Marcus realized, more valuable than he had understood. He had never really thought about selling it before, so he had never really considered its monetary value in any concrete way. He had thought about its value to him in terms of the life it had allowed him to live. But in purely financial terms, it was worth a fortune. This realization was slightly nauseating. He had spent his entire adult life building and maintaining something that was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. If he had been ruthless about it, if he had extracted every possible dollar of profit from it, if he had sold out and reinvested in different ventures, he would probably be significantly wealthier now. But he hadn't done that. He had treated the land as something more important than just a financial asset. He had tried to be a good steward of it. He had invested in maintaining its productivity for the long term rather than maximizing short-term profit. And now he was going to sell it, probably to someone who would treat it purely as a financial asset, someone who would extract profit from it until it wasn't profitable anymore, and then they would move on to the next investment. It made sense economically. It didn't make sense in terms of any deeper value system. The farm sold in September of 2019, 6 months before the COVID-19 pandemic would shut down the world and bring everything into question. The buyer was a corporation based in Illinois called Midwest Agricultural Holdings. They owned multiple farms across the Midwest, totaling about 15,000 acres. They operated through a management company that hired local farmers to actually work the land, paying them a salary and a percentage of the profits. It was an efficient model. The corporation handled the financing, the equipment, the marketing, and the administration. The local farmers handled the day-to-day work. The corporation's representative, a man named Thomas Chen, was professional and respectful when he came to close the deal. He explained the company's philosophy. They wanted to operate the farms as well as possible, to maintain soil health and productivity, to be good stewards of the land. He said all the right things. Marcus wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that his land would be okay, that it would be cared for the way he had cared for it. But he also knew that words and intentions were one thing, and the actual pressures of operating a large-scale agricultural business were another. The corporation had to generate returns for its investors. That meant extracting profit from the land. And when you're extracting profit as your primary goal, sometimes the land suffers. Still, what choice did Marcus have? The land was no longer his. He had signed the papers. The money had been transferred to his bank account. he was officially retired. The feeling was strange. He had been preparing for this moment for years, had wrestled with the decision for months, but now that it was here, he didn't know what to do with himself. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't have the farm to wake up for. He didn't have fields to walk. He didn't have equipment to maintain or crops to tend. He didn't have the structure that had organized every single day of his existence since he was a child. His wife tried to be supportive. She talked about trips they could take, projects they could do around the house, time with the grandchildren. These things sounded nice in the abstract, but Marcus found himself struggling with a kind of depression that he couldn't quite articulate to anyone. He had sold his soul to buy freedom, and now he didn't know what to do with the freedom. The story of Marcus Webb and his farm was just one story among millions, but it was a story that was playing out in thousands of variations across rural America, and it was a story that had profound consequences that extended far beyond the individual farms or the individual farmers. One of those consequences was the erosion of agricultural knowledge. For most of human history, agricultural knowledge had been encoded in communities. It was passed down through generations, refined by experience, adapted to local conditions. This knowledge was vast and sophisticated and often intuitive. People understood how to work with their particular soil, their particular climate, their particular ecosystem. But when farms consolidated and industrialized, this knowledge became less valuable. What mattered now was being able to operate expensive equipment and apply standardized chemical inputs according to centralized guidelines. The deep, local knowledge that farmers like Marcus and his father had possessed became irrelevant. In fact, it was sometimes an obstacle to the industrial model, which preferred standardized approaches that could be applied across different regions. This meant that as the old farmers retired and died, their knowledge died with them. The younger workers who replaced them, and they were often hired workers rather than family members, didn't have the decades of apprenticeship that would have allowed them to develop the same level of understanding. They were given instructions, and they followed them. They didn't understand the land the way Marcus had understood it. The consequences of this loss were subtle but real. It meant that the agricultural system became more fragile, not more robust. It meant that when unexpected challenges arose, unusual weather, new pests, soil problems, there were fewer people who knew how to adapt and respond creatively. The system was optimized for normal conditions, but normal conditions were becoming less normal. It also meant that the potential for regenerative agriculture, farming practices that actually improve the soil and the ecosystem rather than degrading it, was being lost. These practices required knowledge and intuition and willingness to experiment, things that the industrial model didn't encourage. The industrial model wanted predictability and standardization and maximum short-term output. It didn't want farmers thinking about long-term health or trying new approaches. This tension between the industrial model and a more sustainable model was one of the great unresolved contradictions of modern agriculture. The industrial model worked in the sense that it produced abundant food, but it came at a cost. The soil was being depleted. Groundwater was being drawn down faster than it could be replenished. Monoculture created vulnerability to pests and diseases. Chemical inputs were accumulating in the environment. Biodiversity was being destroyed. All of this was well documented by agronomists and environmental scientists, but it was difficult to change the system because the system was locked in place by economics and policy and the interests of large corporations that profited from the current model. And the absence of young farmers entering the system meant that there was no constituency pushing for change from within agriculture itself. Young people with new ideas and energy and willingness to experiment might have pushed the system towards something more sustainable. But the young people were gone. The ones who stayed in agriculture were mostly those who had accepted the industrial model, either because they had inherited large operations that were built on it, or because they had been trained in the technical schools that taught the industrial approach. The opportunity to reshape agriculture in a more sustainable direction was narrowing with each passing year, and most people didn't even notice it was happening. In the months after selling his farm, Marcus found himself becoming increasingly involved in a kind of involuntary study of American agriculture and its future. He was reading more, articles, books, academic papers. He was watching documentaries. He was going to lectures that local agricultural groups organized. He was trying to understand what had happened to him and to farming and to the world he had known. One of the things that struck him was how little the general public understood about agriculture. When he talked to people from the cities, his daughter Sarah's friends when he visited San Francisco, or his daughter Emily's theater colleagues when he went to New York, they had almost no conception of how food was actually produced or how fragile the system was. They thought of farming as something that happened in the background of their lives, something that other people did, so that food would appear in supermarkets. The details of that process were invisible to them. They didn't know about the consolidation of agriculture, or the loss of family farms, or the aging farmer population, or the challenge of soil depletion. They didn't know because nobody was telling them, and the system itself was designed to hide these realities. This invisibility was in some ways the biggest problem of all, because if people didn't understand what was happening to agriculture, they couldn't make informed decisions as consumers or voters. They couldn't demand change. They couldn't support farmers who were trying to do things differently. They could only perpetuate the system that was already in place by buying the cheap food that the system produced, by not asking questions about where that food came from or how it was made. Marcus had spent his entire life working to produce food, and he had never been part of this broader conversation. He had just done his job. He had grown crops, raised animals, paid his bills, lived his life. He hadn't been trying to save the world or fight against industrialization or preserve some idealized version of rural America. He had just been doing what his father had taught him to do. But now, in his retirement, he found himself thinking about these larger questions, not with any sense that he could change anything, but simply out of a need to understand. One of the things he learned was that there was a growing movement of people who were trying to create alternatives to the industrial food system. They were starting small farms, often using organic or regenerative methods. They were forming cooperatives. They were selling directly to consumers through farmers' markets or CSA programs. They were writing books and giving talks and trying to raise awareness about the problem. These people were often young, and they were often not from farming backgrounds. They were people who had chosen farming rather than having been born into it. They were attracted to farming because they wanted to work with the land and grow real food and be part of building a more sustainable system. They were fighting against the tide, and they knew it, but they kept trying anyway. Reading about these people made Marcus feel both hopeful and sad. Hopeful, because it meant that the tradition of farming wasn't entirely dead, that there were still people who understood that agriculture was about more than just extraction and profit. Sad, because he knew how hard their path was going to be, how difficult it was going to be to build sustainable alternatives in a world that had been organized around industrial agriculture for so long. He also felt a kind of guilt. He had been part of the system that had created all of these problems. He had benefited from it. He had participated in the consolidation by modernizing his farm, by using chemical inputs, by adopting the practices that the agricultural establishment recommended. He hadn't been trying to harm anything, but by going along with the system, he had contributed to its perpetuation. The guilt was irrational, he knew. He had done what millions of farmers had done, what the system had pressured them all to do. He couldn't have single-handedly resisted or changed the system, but rationality didn't make the guilt go away. 6 months after selling his farm, Marcus and his wife Sarah decided to take a trip to Europe. They had talked about doing this for years, and now that Marcus was retired and they had money from the sale of the farm, it seemed like the right time. They spent a month traveling through France and Italy and Switzerland, visiting small villages, eating local food, looking at the countryside. It was beautiful and interesting, and for a while, it distracted Marcus from his grief. But then they spent a few days in Tuscany, in the countryside south of Florence, and something unexpected happened. They were staying in a small agriturismo, a farm that had been converted to offer rooms and meals to tourists, and the owner was a man named Marco, who was about Marcus's age. One evening, over dinner, Marcus started asking Marco about his farm. Marco's property was about 100 acres, roughly the same size as Marcus's had been. But instead of growing commodity crops like corn and soybeans, Marco was growing a variety of crops for local restaurants and for direct sale to consumers. He had olives and grapes for wine, wheat for bread, vegetables, fruit trees, herbs. He raised sheep and pigs and chickens. He also rented rooms to tourists, which provided a significant portion of his income. The system was complex but integrated. The animals ate the crop residues. Their waste fertilized the soil. The crops rotated based on what the soil needed. Nothing was wasted. Everything was connected to everything else. As Marco explained all of this, Marcus felt something shift inside him. This was what his father had done, in a much more limited way, before agriculture had become industrialized. This was the kind of diversified farming that had sustained rural communities for centuries. "Why did you choose to farm this way?" Marcus asked Marco. Marco shrugged. "It's how farming has always been done here. My family has worked this land for 7 generations. When I inherited it, I could have sold it to the developers or the corporations, and I probably would have made more money. But I didn't want to. I wanted to continue what my family had been doing. I wanted to know where my food came from. I wanted to work with the land instead of just extracting profit from it." "Isn't it hard?" Marcus asked. "Very hard," Marco said. "Much harder than if I just grew olives and sold them to cooperatives. Much harder than if I farmed the industrial way. But it's also much more interesting. And I think maybe it's more sustainable. At least it has been sustainable for 7 generations. The industrial way has only been around for 50 or 60 years. We don't know yet if it's sustainable for the long term." Marcus nodded slowly. He found himself thinking about his own children, about why they had left. They had left partly because farming was hard, yes, but they had also left because the life their father was offering didn't seem interesting or appealing compared to the lives they could build in cities, pursuing careers and opportunities that seemed more fulfilling. But Marco's farm seemed different. It seemed like a life that would be genuinely interesting if you had chosen it. It seemed like a life where you would be doing something meaningful, where you would be connected to the land and the seasons and the rhythms of nature in a way that was rare in modern life. And yet Marcus had also seen that Marco didn't have children. Marco had never married. When Marco was gone, would his farm also disappear? Or would someone else take it over? Someone from outside the family? "Do you have someone who will take over the farm when you retire?" Marcus asked. Marco's expression became sad. "I don't know," he said. "I have no children. I think about this all the time. My cousins have children, but none of them are interested in farming. So when I'm gone, the farm will probably be sold. It will probably become a development, or it will be absorbed into a larger operation. The system that my family built over 7 generations will end with me." Marcus felt a wave of sympathy for Marco and also recognition. Marco was facing the same thing that Marcus had faced, the knowledge that he was the last link in a chain that stretched back generations and would end with him. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "Yes." "Well," Marco said with a tired smile, "that's the modern world. Everything changes. Nothing is permanent. Even the things we think are permanent, like the land, are not really ours to keep forever. We're just borrowing it for a little while." That conversation haunted Marcus for weeks after he returned home. It made him think about what had happened in his own country, in his own region over the past 50 years. It made him think about what was still happening. The United States, like most developed countries, was in the process of losing its agricultural knowledge and capacity. The farms were being consolidated. The young people were leaving. The corporate operations were taking over. Within a generation or two, the idea that America was a nation of farmers would be completely gone from living memory. Most people didn't seem to realize what was being lost. Or maybe they did realize it at some level, but they accepted it as inevitable. This was the modern world. This was progress. You couldn't stop it. You could only adapt to it. But Marcus was starting to wonder if that was really true. He was starting to wonder if it was actually possible to have different choices, if American agriculture didn't have to follow this path. There were countries that had maintained more small-scale, diversified agriculture. Italy was one of them, as he had just seen. France was another. Many countries in Asia and Africa still had mostly small-scale farmers. The dominant model of industrial agriculture was not as universal as it sometimes seemed. In the United States, there were also people trying to build alternatives. The local food movement was growing. Farmers' markets were becoming more popular. People were becoming more interested in where their food came from. CSA programs were expanding. Some young people were actually moving back to rural areas to start farms. But these alternatives were still marginal, still representing a tiny fraction of the total agricultural production. The industrial system was still dominant. The incentives and the policies and the economics all favored the industrial model. And time was running out. The window for change was closing as the farmer population aged and was not replaced. In 10 years or 20 years, the agricultural system would be mostly corporate-controlled, the knowledge would be mostly lost, and it would be much harder to change directions. Marcus found himself becoming passionate about this in a way he hadn't expected. He started going to meetings of the local Audubon Society and the Watershed Association. He started corresponding with some of the young farmers who were trying to start farms in his county. He started writing letters to the editor of the newspaper, pointing out the implications of the agricultural consolidation. His wife thought he was being obsessive, and maybe he was, but it gave him something to do. It gave him a sense that he could still contribute something, even though he was no longer farming himself. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived in March of 2020, about 6 months after Marcus had sold his farm. Supply chains broke down. People started thinking more carefully about where their food came from and whether the system was resilient enough to rely on. Processing plants shut down because workers got sick. Transportation networks were disrupted. Some products became scarce in supermarkets, and people hoarded. There was a surge of interest in growing food locally. People started home gardens. They bought shares in CSA programs. They went to farmers' markets. Some of the young farmers who had been struggling to get their operations off the ground suddenly found that they had more customers than they could handle. For a brief moment, it seemed like things might change, like people might wake up and realize that the industrial food system wasn't working and that there were alternatives. But the moment passed. As the pandemic receded and people went back to their normal lives, the surge of interest in local food faded. Supply chains were restored. Supermarkets were full again. People went back to buying cheap food without thinking too much about where it came from. The structural problems of agriculture remained unchanged. The young farmers who had experienced a boom in 2020 and 2021 found themselves facing the same economic pressures they had always faced. Equipment was still expensive. Land was still expensive. Labor was hard to find. Margins were still thin. The consolidation would continue. Now, in 2024, Marcus was 70 years old. He had been retired for 5 years. His children had their own lives and their own families. He lived in a house in town, a comfortable house that he and Sarah had bought. He had time on his hands. He gardened, though not with the intensity that he had once brought to his farming. He read. He volunteered with local organizations. He tried to be a good husband and grandfather. It wasn't depression exactly, but rather a chronic melancholy, a sense of something precious having been lost. The new owners, Midwest Agricultural Holdings, was still operating it through a local manager, had made some changes. The farmhouse where Marcus had lived was abandoned now, the doors and windows boarded up. The equipment shed had been expanded. The whole operation had been streamlined to maximize efficiency. The land still looked productive. The crops still grew. From the road, you could see the fields. He had moved away from farming, and the farming had gone on without him. That was natural. That was how the world worked. Nothing was permanent. Everything changed. But he couldn't help but feel that something important had been lost in that change. The knowledge that his father had taught him the understanding of the land that had taken a lifetime to develop the sense of stewardship and responsibility that came from working the same soil as your ancestors. All of that had been discarded in the service of efficiency and profit. And in exchange, what had been gained? Cheap food, certainly. Abundant food, yes, but also soil that was becoming degraded, water systems that were being depleted, rural communities that were being hollowed out, young people who had no connection to the land or to the work that sustained them. It seemed like a bad trade from Marcus's perspective, but he was just one old man, and his perspective didn't matter much. The system had already been decided by economic forces and corporate interests and government policies, and millions of individual consumer choices to buy cheap food without asking where it came from. The world had moved on. Rural America was being emptied out. Agriculture was being industrialized and corporatized. The knowledge was being lost. The connection between people and the land was being severed. And in a generation or two, the idea that America had once been a nation of farmers would be completely forgotten, replaced by the idea that agriculture was just something that corporations did with machines and chemicals and centralized control. Marcus couldn't change that. Nobody could. The trajectory was set. But he could remember. He could bear witness to what had been lost. He could tell the story to whoever would listen of what farming had been like when it was done by families who loved the land, who understood it, who took care of it not just for profit, but because it mattered. He could do that. And perhaps if he did it well enough, someone would listen and be moved and would think about these questions and would make different choices in their own lives. That was all he could do. And so that was what he had decided to do. In the years after his retirement, Marcus had become something of a local figure. He gave talks at schools about agriculture and rural life. He wrote op-eds in regional newspapers. He started a blog where he reflected on agricultural issues and the history of farming in his county. He connected with other retired farmers who were dealing with similar feelings of loss and displacement. He learned that his experience was remarkably common. Most of the farmers who had retired in the past decade or so had faced similar decisions about whether to sell to large operations or hold on to their land. Most of them had grandchildren who had no interest in farming. Most of them felt a similar sense of grief about the way agriculture was changing. There was a network of these retired farmers, and they had started meeting regularly to discuss agricultural policy and what might be done to support young farmers and to preserve smaller-scale farming operations. It was a small movement, and it was unlikely to change the broad trajectory of agriculture. But it gave the farmers a sense that they weren't alone in their concerns, and it gave them a platform to advocate for alternatives. One of the things that emerged from these conversations was a deeper understanding of what had to change if smaller-scale farming was going to survive. The economics were the most obvious issue. Equipment was too expensive, land was too expensive, the margins were too thin. But there were also policy issues. The agricultural subsidies that the government provided mostly benefited large operations. The regulations made it harder for small farmers to sell directly to consumers. The tax structure favored consolidation and penalized smaller operations. If the government wanted to support smaller-scale farming, it could. It could reform the subsidy system, it could streamline the regulations. It could create tax incentives for conservation and soil health. It could fund agricultural education and make it easier for young people to access land and equipment. But the government was controlled by different interests. The large agricultural corporations had more political power than small farmers. The subsidies were structured the way they were because of the interests that had designed them. Change was possible in theory, but it would require a political shift, and that didn't seem likely. And so the consolidation continued, the farms continued to disappear. The knowledge continued to be lost, the rural communities continued to decline. Marcus had made peace with this, or something like peace. He understood that he couldn't change the big forces that were reshaping agriculture. He could only bear witness and try to preserve what knowledge and understanding he could pass on to others. He had started working with one of the young farmers in the area, a woman named Amanda, who had started a small organic farm about 5 years ago. Amanda had grown up in Minneapolis and had come to farming through an interest in food systems and environmental sustainability. She didn't have family farming experience, so she was learning everything from scratch. Marcus had become a kind of informal mentor to her. He would go out to her farm and help her think through problems, soil issues, pest management, equipment decisions, seasonal timing. He couldn't teach her everything he knew, that would take a lifetime, but he could give her enough to accelerate her learning and help her avoid some of the mistakes that farmers often made. Amanda had about 20 acres, mostly vegetables and small grains, with some chickens and bees. She sold at farmers' markets and had a small CSA program. She made enough to live on, but not much more. It was a precarious existence. But Amanda was happy. She loved what she did. She was connected to the land. She understood her relationship to the seasons and the weather. She knew where her food came from, and even though the economics were difficult, she had found a way to make it work, at least for now. Watching Amanda farm gave Marcus some hope. Not a lot, not enough to think that the big trajectory was going to change, but enough to think that something was being preserved, that the knowledge hadn't completely died, that there were still people who understood that agriculture was about more than just profit, even if they were a tiny minority. On a morning in early spring of 2024, Marcus went out to Amanda's farm. The weather had been warming up and things were starting to grow. It was the time of year when the whole earth seemed to be waking up, reaching toward the sun, full of potential. Marcus and Amanda spent the morning working on the vegetable beds, turning soil and adding compost. It was not the same as farming on his own land. Nothing would ever be the same as that. But it was something. It was a way of staying connected to the work that had defined his life. As they worked, Amanda was telling him about her plans for the year. She wanted to expand the CSA program. She wanted to try some new crops. She was thinking about raising goats as well as chickens. She was excited and hopeful, the way young farmers are when they believe they can build something. Marcus listened and offered suggestions and shared his knowledge. He felt useful, which was something he didn't feel very often in his retirement. And he felt like he was doing something that mattered, like he was passing on something that was worth preserving. When they finished the morning's work, they sat under a tree that was just beginning to bud, drinking coffee that Amanda had made. "Thank you for coming out," Amanda said. "I don't know what I would do without your help." "You'd figure it out," Marcus said. "You're a good farmer." "I don't feel like a good farmer," Amanda said. "I feel like I'm making it up as I go along." "That's what all farmers do," Marcus said. "That's what being a farmer is. Paying attention, learning from experience, adapting. No one's born knowing how to farm. Everyone learns it." Amanda nodded. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Do you miss farming your own land?" Marcus took a long time answering. "Every day," he said finally. "I miss it every single day. But not in the way you might think. I don't miss the work exactly. My back is grateful that I don't have to do that work anymore. I miss the purpose. I miss having something that depended on me. I miss the connection to the land." "Why did you sell?" Amanda asked. "Because I had to," Marcus said. "Because there was no one to take over. Because the economics didn't make sense anymore. Because I was tired." He paused. "And because I didn't want to accept it either. I kept hoping one of my kids would come back, all the way up until I had to decide. But they didn't. They had their own lives." "Do you regret it?" "No," Marcus said. "I made the right decision for me at that time. But I regret that it had to be the choice that I had to make. I regret that farming isn't sustainable in America anymore for people like me, people who want to do it the way my father did it. I regret that." They sat in silence for a while, watching the spring morning warm up around them. "I'm going to try," Amanda said finally. "I'm going to try to keep this going. I don't know if I'll be able to do it forever, but I'm going to try." "I know you are," Marcus said. "That's all any of us can do." The story of American agriculture was ultimately a story about choices, choices that had been made individually and collectively by farmers and by consumers, by governments and by corporations, by families, deciding where their children should live and what kind of work they should do. It was a story about values. What did society value? Cheap food or healthy soil? Efficiency or sustainability? Corporate profit or community health? Rural livelihoods or urban convenience? For the past 50 years, American society had consistently chosen the former in each of these pairs. The result was an agricultural system that produced abundant, cheap food, but at a cost that was largely invisible to the people who consumed that food. The cost was borne by the soil, by the water systems, by the rural communities, by the farmers themselves, by the animals raised in confinement, and by the agricultural workers who were often exploited and underpaid. It was possible, in theory, to make different choices. It was possible to design an agricultural system that valued soil health and community viability, as well as abundant, cheap food. It was possible to support young farmers and to preserve agricultural knowledge. It was possible to build a more sustainable system, but doing so would require changing policy and changing economics and changing consumer behavior and changing the way American society thought about agriculture and rural life. It would require powerful interests to accept lower profits. It would require consumers to pay higher prices for food. It would require young people to choose differently, to choose farming even though other opportunities were available. These things weren't impossible, but they seemed unlikely. The trajectory was set. The forces that had driven consolidation and industrialization were still strong. The policy frameworks that favored large operations hadn't changed. The economics that rewarded extractive agriculture and penalized stewardship remained in place, and time was running out. Every year, more of the old farmers retired. Every year, fewer young people entered farming. Every year, a little more of the knowledge was lost. A little more of the infrastructure was dismantled. A little more of the possibility of a different agricultural future was foreclosed. In a generation or two, it might be too late. The system might be so consolidated, so dependent on corporate control, so technologically locked in, that reversing course would be nearly impossible. Or perhaps something would change. Perhaps the pandemic's disruptions would have lasting effects on how people thought about food security. Perhaps climate change would force a reckoning with the unsustainability of the current system. Perhaps a new generation of young people would decide that they wanted different kinds of lives connected to the land and to genuine work, and they would be willing to figure out how to make farming economically viable again. But Marcus didn't think he would live to see that. He would go to his grave knowing that his way of farming, his father's way of farming, the way his ancestors had farmed for 100 years, was disappearing, that the knowledge was being lost, that the connection between people and land was being severed, that something precious and irreplaceable was being sacrificed in the service of efficiency and profit. It was a kind of grief that didn't have an outlet, didn't have a clear resolution. It was just something he would have to carry for as long as he lived. But in carrying it, he could at least bear witness. He could tell the story. He could work with young farmers like Amanda and try to pass on what knowledge he could preserve. He could write and speak and advocate for alternatives. He could refuse to accept that the current trajectory was inevitable. It probably wouldn't change anything. But he had to try. Because the alternative was to give up completely, to accept that his entire life's work had been meaningless, that the world had moved on and didn't need what he knew anymore. He wasn't ready to do that yet. So he would keep going out to Amanda's farm. He would keep writing his blog. He would keep attending meetings and giving talks and sharing his knowledge with anyone who would listen. He would keep tending his garden and paying attention to the seasons and the earth. He would keep being a farmer in some form, even though he no longer had land. And maybe in that way something would be preserved. Maybe the knowledge wouldn't be completely lost. Maybe the story of what farming had been would live on in the work of people like Amanda, in the practices of the small farmers who were trying to build alternatives, in the memory of people like Marcus who had spent their lives working the soil. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in a world where so much was being lost, something was enough.